Good afternoon, everyone. I am Arvis Washington, the Deputy Director for the Department of Navy's Office of Small Business Programs, led by our distinguished Director, Mr. Jimmy Smith. On behalf of the Office of Small Business Programs, we thank you for joining us today. We started this webinar series as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic as a way to continue outreach, but received rave reviews and decided to keep it going, committing to hosting at least 3 webinars a month. The Department of the Navy recognizes small businesses are the catalyst of innovation, and we use this platform as a way to attract new business partners. You can view previously recorded events on our website under the Outreach tab and past events, or visit our YouTube channel. I would like to direct you to our website at www.secnav.navy.mil/small-business, where you can find a wealth of information, including our DASN OSBP operations plan. You can locate your small business professional and find information on how to do business with the DASN, including the command's long-range acquisition forecast. To stay current on DASN OSBP upcoming events, you can register for our mailing list on the homepage of our website. To stay up to date about upcoming industry days, command's outreach, and in general, what's happening across the DASN, I also encourage you to connect with us on our social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. To highlight a few of our upcoming webinars, we have the Air Force Small Business Director on May 4th, so you can get registered for that. And then May 13th, we'll highlight the ONR Export Control Program. I hope you seize the opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A feature on this platform. Today, we have a dynamic panel led by Ms. Denise Randolph as the Director of Policy in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Procurement, DASN-P. She is Level 3 Certified Senior Procurement Analyst with over 30 years of contracting experiences in positions such as Director of Contracts for the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle Program, as well as the Deputy at the Naval Research Laboratory. Way to go, Denise, and thank you for your 30 years of service. She has also served as the Director of Contracts for the Deepwater Program and the Chief of Staff for the Office of Procurement Operations, both in the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Randolph served for 8 years as the Department of the Navy's voting member on the DART Council, responsible for developing the acquisition rules and guidance for the acquisition and procurement workforce until the recent transition to Mr. Michael Brown. Welcome, Denise and Michael, and I'll turn it over to you, ma'am. And thank you for joining us today.
It seems Ms. Randolph may be having a couple of technical difficulties. Mr. Brown, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, will do. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Michael Brown, and just recently took over as the Department of Navy DART Council representative, and you know, I have a fairly vast background regarding the Navy. I'm currently a senior program analyst or senior procurement analyst within the Office of DASN-P. I've had tours with NAVC as a branch head, as well as contracting officer for multiple platforms, including the LHA, as well as the Navy's torpedo programs. And I've also have experience as a buyer in the Joint Strike Fighter program, as well as a sort of a cross DoD experience, having worked at Wright Pat Air Force Base across multiple Air Force platforms. So I believe Denise is having her technical difficulties worked out. Denise, are you available for an intro?
Yeah, thank you very much. I apologize for that. Ms. Washington, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate you and Mr. Smith's invitation for us to come over here and join you. As you indicated, small businesses are the core to everything that we do, and our success very much weighs on their shoulders. So I'm very pleased to be here with you all today. What I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about what we do in DASN-P in terms of the policy shop. We kind of have a broad range of responsibilities. I am the Department of the Navy's DPAS officer. So, you know, if you have a DX or DO rated order, those things are resolved if there are any issues within my office. We do the mergers and acquisitions for the Department of the Navy. So we have quite a bit of influence on the industrial base. And, you know, we resolve all of the policy issues relative to the FAR, the DFARS, and then, of course, the Navy Marine Corps Acquisition Regulation Supplement is owned and managed out of our office. My boss, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Procurement, is Ms. Cindy Shaver, and she extends her gratitude to all of the small businesses as well. She is the Department of Navy's Senior Procurement Executives Representative and the Competition Advocate. So what we do every day really is out here to serve you guys. I'm not going to spend a lot of time right now talking to you guys because there's a lot of great information that Michael wants to share with you. But on the back end, if there are a few extra minutes available and it's something that you're interested in, we may talk about some of the upcoming changes to legislation. Obviously, you all are probably aware of the $15 minimum wage executive order that was just recently signed. And then any other questions you may have surrounding procurement or procurement-related questions. So without further ado, Michael, I appreciate you stepping in for me while I had those technical difficulties. I turn the mic over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, ma'am. So as you're all aware, we are the topic of discussion for this afternoon is the rulemaking process, and we're also going to touch on some current events, current cases, as well as kind of what's foremost in front of or at the forefront of the DoD's mind. And so if you go to the next slide, our agenda for today is going to be so an overview of the rulemaking process and how the councils are structured and just the procedural aspect of things. Then I'll go into some do you knows, and that's kind of getting after the current events or things that are important right now to the DoD that we think small businesses should certainly be aware of. After that, we'll go into some doing business with the government, some essentials that you really need to know if you're sort of the the hurdles to before you even want to do business with the government, ducks you have to get in row. And then lastly, the useful websites, where I'll provide a lot of links, many of them at the DPC websites, where you can go out, such as DFARS cases and NDAA trackers, things of that nature. Next slide, please. Moving on to the rulemaking process. The federal acquisition, you can move on to slide 4. The federal acquisition regulation is part of CFR, of 48 CFR Chapter 1. And as it states there, it is the primary policy and procedure document used by all federal executive agencies in the acquisition of supplies, services, and construction. There are a few that do not follow the FAR, and as you see there, the FAA is one that is a frequent example there of a federal agency that does not. The FAR is broken out into 53 parts. I know a lot of this seems basic with parts 1 through 51 being instructions to contracting officers and 52 being clauses, but you'd be surprised how often we have to remind folks that when you're in parts 1 through 51, you're talking to the contracting officer. And if, as my part of the DAR Council, we go over this a lot where, if we're trying to talk to contractors, we need to do so via a contract clause, and that's in part 52. And then obviously in under part 53 is where you'll find all of your standard forms and DD-254s, things of that nature. And the FAR is required by 41 USC 1303, and that requirement simply says that GSA, DoD, and NASA jointly issue and maintain a single government-wide procurement regulation known as the FAR. And so you see there the official versions of the FAR, and I think this is important to have here because certainly most people use acquisition.gov. You see it there. It's the FAR's official version, But it's important to note that it is not the official version for the DFARS or the NMCARS. So while it certainly has benefit from a searchability, the search functions on acquisition.gov are great. So when you're doing your research, there's clear benefit to using it, but if you want to be certain that you are looking at the most recent and most current, then you see there that the DFARS and NMCARS, those official versions are housed elsewhere. Next slide, please. As far as sources of FAR, DFARS, and PGI changes, it comes in many forms. I think the one that's kind of most often thought about is legislation, where something becomes law and it's a triggering event to trigger rulemaking. But that's not the only way that the rulemaking process is triggered. There's GAO recommendations, court decisions, executive orders, like Denise mentioned, the $15 minimum hourly rate. That's certainly going to be a triggering event for rulemaking. And then there's also recommendations that could be DoD, agency recommendations. It could be an individual recommendation or something that industry comes up with that requires to go through the rulemaking process. And then obviously policy changes. So, you'll see a lot of, later in the slide, I talk a lot about cybersecurity, and then also, supply chain risk management, things like that, policy changes. If the DoD sees something in the current procurement landscape, then that requires some policy changes. That could certainly be a source for triggering a rulemaking event. Next slide, please. The Federal Acquisition Regulation Council. So there are, the FAR Council members. The FAR Council chair is actually the administrator for OFPP, and the membership is the DoD, GSA, and NASA. And their primary responsibilities are to ensure, number one, ensure consistency with the President's management budget, but also to resolve impasses. So when you have the DAR Council, as well as the Civilian Agency Acquisition Council, both trying to come up with the, a FAR rule, you could imagine that they're, it may not happen too often, but there are some impasses that do need to be resolved at a higher level. And that's really where the FAR Council members come into play to resolve those types of impasses. Next slide. So the DAR Council is kind of where we'll spend most of our time talking about DAR Council and DFARS rules. The chair of the DAR Council is DPC DARS, Ms. Linda Nielsen, and the DAR Council voting membership is comprised of is 5 members, which is the 3 military departments, Army, Navy, and Air Force, as well as the 2 defense agencies, DCMA and DLA. And you'll see the responsibilities there, obviously, to promulgate the FAR and the DFARS PGI, as well as the FAR, and with that has to be done in conjunction with the CAC. And so as far as publishing, another responsibility is to publish Federal Register notices and solicit public comments. So most often would be, if we're trying to solicit public comment, it would be a proposed rule. However, there are instances where we have to jump right to an interim rule. So an agency might find it has good cause to issue a final rule. I have an example later in the slide deck regarding CMMC, as well as the NIST assessment, and that's an example where there was a determination made by OSD that urgent and compelling reasons related to cybersecurity required in the publication of an interim rule. And in that case, it takes effect. It could take effect immediately. In that case, it had a delayed effect of a month, but it could take effect immediately. And but even in those cases, we still do ask for public comment, and those public comments can still be considered when a final rule is published. And then you see there advance notices of proposed rulemaking. If you're trying to think of it in terms of a contract award process, I almost think of this as far as a notice of a proposed contract action. This is sort of a notice of a proposed rulemaking action where we are, we might be just providing as much notice as possible to industry, or we might be asking for a request for information from industry. And then obviously to the last one there is, do we ultimately want to be able to publish final rules after the rulemaking process is complete? Next slide, please. So what is a rule? There's three basic types of rules. The first one being a legislative rule, and you see there that it's oftentimes called a substantive rule, in that it creates legally binding rights and obligations for the agency and the public. So, when you think about that, it's a legislative rule has the force and effect of law, and the Administrative Procedures Act generally requires notice and comment for legislative rules. Conversely, when you have non-legislative rules, there are two different types of those, but when you have a non-legislative rule, it is not meant to have the binding legal effect, and therefore is exempt from the notice and comment. But you'll see the two different types of non-legislative rules there, which is interprets the meaning of a statute, and then you may have policy statements where we're simply, an agency is simply telling the public how it plans to use some discretionary power that it may have. And then lastly, the last type of rule there is more it's organizational and procedural rules. So that may, as the example states there, it may go through the process of how the DoD plans to delegate certain authorities, more internal operating procedures. Next slide, please. So how does an agency identify the need for rulemaking? Well, the first one you see there is what probably the most often, or the most clear one that we sometimes think about when we go through the rulemaking process. You kind of have the annual, the FY21 NDAA comes out. Congress specifically requires a rule, or specifically requires rulemaking to begin by a certain date, and so that's the statutory mandate. But that is certainly not the only way that agencies identify a need for rulemaking. So there are, when an agency identifies a problem, it might be industry behavior that has adverse effects on the consumers, or for the DoD, for the warfighter. So if we're talking, supply chain risk management, counterfeit parts, if we identify a problem, that can certainly trigger rulemaking. If we're having difficulties enforcing existing rules, and we have that evidence to say that we need to modify the rule to be able to better enforce it, that's another example there. Certainly changes in technology over time, when we have standards that are listed in the regulations, once those become obsolete, that could certainly trigger a rule. Next slide, please. This slide shows a timeline of, we have another slide, not in this presentation, but it shows the timeline for a typical FAR case, but this is your typical DFARS case. And so we talked about the sources of, what's the triggering event, or what's the source to trigger rulemaking. And you'll see here that once, we don't have that sort of event on here, but once that event occurs, DPC will make the decision to open a case to go through the rulemaking process. And they will assign a case manager, and the case manager will assign it to a certain DFARS team or sub-team. And we have each of the agencies have membership on those teams, subject matter experts that are assigned. So when cases get assigned to a certain team, they're ready to work the case. So you see there that we typically have allotted 7 weeks. That could certainly fluctuate by a couple weeks, plus or minus, depending on the complexity of the statute trying to be implemented or the rulemaking effort. But they will work the case, come up with the draft FAR rule, as well as the draft Federal Register notice, and then provide all of that documentation to the FAR Council, where we will have 2 weeks to review it and deliberate to try to come to a consensus. And once that consensus is made, it'll get sent to the DAR editor for review, then on to OFPP and OIRA for clearance. And then it gets, if it's a DFARS rule we're talking about here, it'll get sent back to the DAR editor for publication. And we will typically publish the rule for 60 days. I know we've had efforts or rulemaking actions that have been out there for 30 days, and typically those can get extended, or they haven't. So typically the 60 days is sort of the benchmark that we typically work towards, and then once those comments come back from industry, it'll go back to the same case manager and the same team to analyze all of industry's comments and see if there needs to be changes to the rule. And then the process repeats itself. It goes back to DAR Council for further deliberation and ultimately results in the publication of a final rule. Next slide, please. That previous slide is probably a good spot to mention that we oftentimes get in my office, as well as the Navy Office of Small Business, they get questions a lot about what is the Department of Navy doing for implementing XYZ before it's been implemented in the regulations. So a good example might be if you have an SBA rule that or a rule that's out for public comment. We get questions a lot of what are we doing to implement, and we have to. This is a good reminder that we aren't moving out, we aren't implementing until it's codified in the FAR. So you may have an SBA rule that's hit the Federal Register, and it's that the SBA rule has been updated and it's been published to the FRN, but it still needs to be codified in the FAR before it takes effect. So that was something I did want to touch on before moving on to this next slide. And you'll see here on this slide 11, just another foot stomp to get involved. So when you go to the Federal Register, we encourage you to review the FAR, DFARS for proposed and interim rules, as well as the DPC website there. They do a great job of issuing publication notices, and they'll have all the links to in their publication notices. They'll have links to the Federal Register for each of the rules that they've published throughout the period that they're trying to capture with the notice. Also encourage you to submit input via the online procedures, and each rule has its own set of procedures that you could, oftentimes there's the ability to go to regulations.gov to submit public comments, or you might be able to submit public comments directly to a certain email inbox. So each rule will give you the instructions on how best to do that, but we encourage you to do so. And then the last one there is to view status of open cases as well as NDAA implementation. So you have a link there, and when you go to that link, you will be able to see a status of every DFARS case that is open currently, and then you'll be able to see, like I said, a current status of where it's at, and kind of have a good idea of when it will be kind of hitting the Federal Register, so you can be prepared to look at the rule. And there's also an NDAA implementation tracker. So when you click on that, I think it's the past 11 years worth of sections for each of the NDAAs. It will tell you, where, if it's already been implemented in a final rule, it'll tell you the case number, when it was implemented, but it will also show all of the open items, the open NDAA sections that have yet to be implemented and the status of those. Next slide, please. So this segment of the briefing is the Do You Know segment, and as I mentioned in the agenda, this is questions that we've been asked a lot recently, to the point where we felt it'd be good to just kind of remind folks of what the regulations say regarding it, or it might be some. I get into some cybersecurity items that are clear, kind of in the forefront of the DoD's minds right now. So next slide. So do you know why there is a task order and delivery order ombudsman? Next slide. And the answer to that is to review complaints from contractors for task orders, for task and delivery orders only. And that is to ensure a fair opportunity to be considered. Well, that is to ensure that offers are given a fair opportunity to be considered, consistent with the procedures in the contract. And I did want to add there that consulting with an ombudsman does not alter or postpone the timeline for other processes such as a protest. And anytime, we do recommend that before consulting with an ombudsman, the contractor first addresses their complaints with the contracting officer for resolution. And if you're looking for the authority for where that lies, it would be FAR 16-505. And what the FAR does require specifically for the task and delivery order ombudsman is a specific name, address, and phone number and email address for who each agency's ombudsman is. And so when you go to the NMCARS, you will see just that for the Department of the Navy. You'll see Miss Cindy Shaver, and her contact information is there. And that's the same contact information you'll see when you look up the NMCARS. Next slide. Do you know if there are any opportunities to ask questions after a debrief is provided? And the answer to that question, next slide please, is yes. So unsuccessful and disappointed offers can submit questions after the debrief is complete. And when was this changed? This was changed in March of 2018 via a class deviation. And so if you go to, this was in the FY18 NDAA, and it's going to be implemented in the DFARS at 215. But it, even though this was in the FY18 NDAA, it is yet to be implemented. So oftentimes, I talked about the 12-month standard process there. Sometimes when there's a class deviation that puts the rule into effect, there's less urgency to be able to get that rule pushed through the rulemaking process. And so you'll see here, this is an FY18 NDAA that has yet to be fully implemented into the DFARS. But if you go out to the case status report or the NDAA tracker, you'll see that it is associated with case 2018 D009. And specifically what it does is within DoD, unsuccessful and disappointed offers are provided an opportunity to submit additional questions within 2 business days after the debrief. And so it's the debrief is not considered complete until the agency delivers its written response accordingly. So this is, you'll hear this referred to as the enhanced debrief. So there, it's no longer the PCO saying that the debrief is officially concluded. And having a protest or any sort of associated timelines to begin. Then all of those timelines, the debrief is not considered over until the agency delivers its written responses if they get any questions. Next slide. Do you know the cybersecurity requirements associated with DFARS 252, 204, 7012? Next slide. And the answer to that is, here are some of the requirements. It requires contractors to have adequate security on all covered contractor information systems. It requires compliance with NIST 800-171 for governing CDI, and it requires cyber incident reporting. And so when is it required? Anytime the solicitation or contract contains the subject DFARS clause. And so it's important to note that the contract will contain that clause unless we are talking about procurement solely for COTS items. Next slide. And that's a good jumping point into the next do you know, which is, do you know how the DoD is assessing industry implementation of cybersecurity requirements? Next slide. So we just talked about the 7012 clause requirements and how it requires compliance with NIST. And so how is DoD monitoring the implementation, or how is DoD assessing industry's compliance with this? And the answer to that is twofold. The first one is the NIST DoD assessment methodology, and this was implemented on 30 November of 2020 via the interim rule that you see there, 2019 D014 is the DFARS case. And so this will be required anytime the solicitation contains the provision 252, 204, 7019, or the contract clause 252, 204, 7020. And again, those will be in any contracts except for procurements solely for COTS. And so what specifically is required by that provision and clause? Well, the provision requires offers to implement NIST standards to have a current NIST DoD assessment on record in order to be considered for award. And specifically, those assessments are required to be posted in SPRS. And as far as what the clause requires of contractors, they need to provide the government access to its facilities, systems, and personnel when it is necessary for DoD to conduct or renew a higher level assessment. And they also need to ensure applicable subcontractors have the results of a current assessment posted in SPRS prior to awarding a subcontract or other contract vehicle. Next slide. The second way that the DoD is monitoring the compliance with cybersecurity requirements is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Framework, and that's the CMMC. So when is it implemented? It was included in the same interim rule that we just discussed for the DoD assessment, but for the NIST assessments, but it has a phased rollout. So it's slightly more complicated, but basically effective 30 November of 2020, this went into effect. However, during the phased rollout period, which is from November of 2020 to October of 2025, inclusion of a CMMC level requirement requires the approval of OUSD ANS. So in order to have a statement of work requirement that is tied to CMMC, the PCO and the program office is going to have to get that approved at the ANS level. After 1 October 2025, it will be fully implemented. And as you can see there, it will be required, just like the other ones, for all procurements, except those procurements solely for COTS items. And what specifically is required by the clause? That would be that the contractors need to maintain the requisite CMMC level during the duration of the contract, ensure its subcontractors have also have the appropriate CMMC level prior to awarding a subcontract, and also include the requirements of the clause in all subcontracts. So that's obviously a big one there. Next slide, please. So do you know what the Supplier Performance Risk System, aka SPRS, is, and how the DoD is using it related to cybersecurity? So we just talked a little bit about cybersecurity and the use of SPRS. And so what SPRS is it is a web-enabled enterprise application that gathers, processes, and displays data about supplier performance. And so you see there when and what. Well, in 2020, SPRS was updated. So SPRS has been around since before 2020, but specifically in 2020, it was updated to document, store, and retrieve summary results from NIST assessments. And why it was updated to do so is the interim rule that we were just talking about that implemented the NIST assessments as well as CMMC. Because that interim rule directs contracting officers to verify in SPRS that an offeror has a DoD assessment on record if the offeror is required to implement NIST. And as I mentioned before, it also requires offerors to ensure results of their applicable DoD assessment is posted in SPRS, and requires contractors to ensure their subcontractors have results posted in SPRS. Next slide, please. So tips for doing business with the government. Next slide. Just a few helpful tips here, and this is probably old news for most of you, but to do business with the government, you must be registered with Dun & Bradstreet, IRS, state. You have to have a cage code, must be registered with the System for Award Management as far as reps and certs, and then potentially, depending on the type of work that you're working on, may need a facility clearance, which requires you to be registered and work with DSS. Depending on the type of contracts that you're trying to enter into, you might need accounting system compliance as well, which would require you to work with DCAA. Next slide. So on to the last segment here, which is useful websites. Next slide. So as you can see here, we have a couple websites, and they're primarily DPC contracting websites. So you have the home page there for DPC. Any of the class deviations that DPC issues is there at the link. Any DFARS changes, the policy vault, the DAR council, and as well as I'd mentioned before, the DFARS case status. So certainly of all of those, they all have their benefits to kind of go out there and comb around to make sure you're current on what's going on with the rulemaking process as it pertains to the DoD. But certainly that DFARS case status is the, you know, it is updated in real time, and you know, it's updated weekly and provides the most current status. So it really does give you a good understanding of rules and when they might be hitting the Federal Register. Next slide. And useful websites. The websites before were DPC's websites. Now we have the Department of Navy websites. So you'll have the DASN-P website, as well as a subsite within that would be our policy push. So we do a, you know, Ms. Randolph does a great job of getting policy pushes pushed out, you know, for the most part weekly. There might be a week or two here and there where we have to lump, you know, 2 weeks together, but for the most part, we do a really good job of issuing policy pushes with relevant information and relevant policy and reminders out on a weekly basis. And also you'll see the Navy Office of Small Business Programs website, and then the Navy Long Range Acquisition Forecast. So the you can go out there and look at the Long Range Acquisition Forecast to see what's in the pipeline for contract actions for the Navy long term. And that is my last slide. So Ms. Washington, if you were getting any questions throughout the presentation, or if they start to pop in now, Ms. Randolph and I are more than willing to answer those.
So we don't have any questions as of yet, but maybe Ms. Randolph can talk to the CARES Act or the minimum wage that the president just signed out. Thank you, ma'am.
Happy to do that. Of course, as soon as I said that, hopefully my camera is still up and running.
It went out, but you can keep going. We'll work it.
Okay, so hopefully you can hear me. So before I talk about the CARES Act, because that's been around a little bit longer, I do want to make sure everybody is aware of the change to the minimum wage that the president just signed out via an executive order. I really want to make sure that you understand how you can get involved and what you can do to make sure your voice is heard, very much as Michael just finished articulating. So even though the executive order was signed and the president has put that into the rules, if you will, that still would have to be implemented through the regulatory process. So this would be your opportunity, as it's being worked through the Federal Register, for you to register your voice. If there are any questions in the way that it's implemented, if you have any concerns in the way that it's implemented, all of that would be provided via the Federal Register notice process. So the teams right now have not yet started to put that case together, but I do expect that that will happen very quickly. So for small businesses, that has the potential to have a substantial impact, not just on your business base moving forward, because quite frankly, there'll be a lesser impact to that because you'll have the opportunity to be able to roll all of that into any of the proposals that you are submitting moving forward. But the way that it is currently in the rule right now, or in the executive order, I don't want to call it a rule yet, in the executive order right now, is you will actually have to go back, and for any of the contracts, at least the way it's written, you'll have to go back, and for any of the contracts that you currently have, those contracts would need to pay anyone in the selected or affected groups that minimum of $15. So the way we're going to implement that, you actually get a say in. And you should really make sure you use your voice at every opportunity in the rulemaking process. The way you do that is by keeping your eye on what is out there in the Federal Register. Or if you want to cheat, as Michael indicated, I actually do publish a policy push. And for most of the cases that have affect to the Department of Navy contracting professionals, so those would be DOD cases as well, I do push those in the policy push. What we do in the Department of Navy is believe that the collection of all of the relevant information that they need to know should happen at a singular point. So it keeps all of the other 5,000 procurement professionals across the Department of Navy from doing the same thing. So you could use that as a cheat sheet. Our website, again, Michael provided you the link, is an open website. So you do have the opportunity to go out there at any time and look to see what we've put out there. We do it in kind of like a snippet. We do it in terms of like snippets. So it'll provide you an overview of the information being provided and then a link to the greater amount of information. Our office is always available. Our contact information is there on the last slide for us to be able to respond to you on any general questions. We do ask that if you have specific questions, especially if it's about a case, there's a case manager that's assigned to that. Go through those folks first. If you have a question specifically about what's happening with your contract or you don't really like the way things are going with your contract, that you work through your contracting officer. But if those aren't successful and you do need a little bit of additional help, we do use our policy at Navy.mil to try to provide those types of assistance. We do not offer legal advice. We will, be mindful of any questions you ask in terms of whether or not there's ongoing legislation. We don't provide pre-decisional information, but we're absolutely willing to help you understand all of the little nuances that the FAR and the DFARS and then the NMCARS may provide. We do understand that that's a lot out there for many of the small businesses to be able to absorb, especially at the pace that some of these change. So please keep your eye on the Federal Register for that $15 minimum wage rule and the implementation of that, and make sure you understand it. And where you don't understand it, questions are free. That is your opportunity to speak up and actually, get any of your questions answered or register your complaints or offer an alternate path perhaps to how we're doing it. We do read and respond to every single comment that comes in. By law, we must do that, and we take that very, very seriously. So I strongly encourage you to stay on top of that. Now, with respect to the CARES Act, so the CARES Act, obviously, it was put in place due to the COVID situation. It has been extended repeatedly, and it right now is running through the end of the fiscal year. So the piece that most people care about is Section 3610. So there's a lot of PPP, but PPP most folks know about. If you're a small business, you probably have already taken advantage of PPP to the extent that you need to. But Section 3610, there are quite a few people who want to know about 3610. I will tell you, DPC did a fantastic job on their website. So they do have kind of like a one-stop shop there. But there are a couple of key tenets that I probably want to point out to you with respect to 3610. So 3610 pays you when you are unable to work, you or your employees are unable to work due to COVID. Now, there are very specific conditions. So it's not because you're at home sick or the kids are at home or any of those kinds of things. OSBP and OMB have made that very clear. But if, in fact, you are working on a government contract and you can't perform because COVID had, you've got to go in and shuffle your line around and your folks can't work while you're actually redoing your line. That is a 3610, that's a potential 3610 claim. Why do I say potential? One of the key tenets of 3610 is it is a reimbursement, it's legislation for reimbursement. It is not prepayment. So you can't say, well, I know I'm not going to be able to work and I'm going to need help with payroll. So I'm going to go ahead and send this to the government and ask them to pay that. It doesn't work like that. It actually only works after you have paid your employees to keep them in a ready state. Then you would go to the government and you would say, hey, you know, our employees, we needed to make sure that we retained our employees, because when it's time for us to start working again, you're going to need us to hit the ground running. So, you know, we paid to keep them in a ready state, and we're coming to you asking you to reimburse us for that payment, okay? It is a reimbursement feature. What I will tell you is that is a risk proposition that you take on your own. The 3610 legislation is a very much discretionary legislation. And I want to say this again because this is very critical. This is where a lot of people just do not understand this particular part. 3610 is discretionary. What Congress did is gave us the authority, not the mandate, but the authority to pay for work not performed due to COVID, okay? The authority. What they didn't do is give us money to do that. So the money that we would have to use would be current mission funds. And across the DoD, different agencies have approached that differently. And so I can't speak to how any business that you do with other than the Navy has approached that. And even within certain pockets of the Navy, it's been looked at a little differently. Every circumstance is different. What is the same is you must perform, you must not work, and you must pay that person to keep them in a ready position, and then you must submit that to the government for reimbursement. This particular act, if the government says, yep, I understand you paid them, but we're not going to pay you, that is not subject to the Disputes Act. So again, because this is very much a 100% discretionary position, it is not subject to dispute. It is very much different than a request for equitable adjustment. So unless the government directs you to do something, or unless the government interferes in your performance, the government is not obligated to pay you for work not performed, okay? So I wanna make sure that that's clear out there. I can't see the questions anymore. Ms. Washington, are there any questions, or are there any topics that anyone would like me to speak, or Michael to speak about?
Yes, ma'am. So we do have a few questions. Do you have any update on the implementation of the good faith effort examples in the FAR?
Updates on good faith efforts? No, because good faith effort is very much another discretionary thing. It's like good business judgment, quite frankly. If you had a circumstance and you said to me, you know, Denise, this is what we did, we tried our best, I might look at that, and given the circumstances and what I know, I'll say you tried your best. However, someone else may look at that and say, well, you know, you didn't do this and you didn't do this. At a minimum, I would have expected you to do this. Those things are very much discretionary, which is why we don't actually put words around it. So if there was a specific circumstance and you felt like, what else could I do? You know, is there anything else I could do? That to me would be the question to ask is, you know, this was what I did. Is there anything else I could do to demonstrate that? Does that answer the question? I don't know that there is an effort ongoing. I'm unaware, you know, Michael, I'm not sure if you're aware, but I'm unaware of any effort to actually capture that and publish it anywhere. We do have in a lot of different places best practices, but I'm not even sure that the best practices would actually go into that level of detail to be able to provide examples of good faith efforts other than in specific scenarios.
Great, thank you, ma'am. So next question. Last summer, DASN-P encouraged industry and government to submit recommendations via the NMCARS challenge. Can you provide a status update on working through these submissions?
Oh my goodness, yes. So we opened that up because we are always open to looking at what we're doing. My office owns that. Specifically, it falls in my team. Ms. Salima McMillan has been honchoing that. We got 653 submissions in for the NMCARS challenge. We were overwhelmed, and we answer each one of those individually. I want to say that there's NMCARS 1818, I believe, is in the works. Salima said to me that she was going to get it to me next week. It has another host of resolutions to NMCARS challenges. So there is part of the links that Michael shared with you provides the NMCARs. We put that out there on our website. That is the official version. And we have started implementing a lot of those. If there is any specific one that you believe you submitted, first of all, you should have gotten an email acknowledging receipt, because that is one of our processes. But we are working through a lot of those. And we give each one, absolute consideration. In many of them, we got really, really, really good suggestions, but they don't always fall within the area that we own within the NMCARs. The NMCARs actually talks to the contracting professional. We got some great suggestions for the requirement side. So we actually don't take them and just throw them over there to them. We do transition them over there, but we monitor them through the process until they actually get an answer, so that we can go back and at least say, here's what's going on. So if there is a particular one that you feel like, you've not heard anything on, you want to check the status on, again, send us an email at policy@navy.mil, and we are happy to provide a status on what's going on in a lot of those. But we did get 653, very much more than we actually expected to get. And we're working those along with all of the rest of the things that we do on a daily basis. So don't give up hope. Don't believe we've blown you off. We have not done that. And actually, we were really excited about that. Folks actually had some really good ideas. So we were encouraged by what we received.
Very nice. Thank you. So this attendee would like to know who they could speak with, or what process is in place for small businesses to propose a rule.
Well, so one, I think Michael provided you a link. The DAR Council is the one who actually decides whether or not they're going to open a case, but you can actually go right through the FRN process. You can also go right, Michael, I'm going to put you out there, because Michael is the Navy's DAR Council rep. So if there's something that you want, if you're one of our Navy small business members, and it's something that you want to do, reach out to Michael. Again, the easy way to get to us is policy@navy.mil. He's absolutely willing to look at that and provide you more one-on-one direction if you'd like to do that. We're always available to be helpful in that manner.
Great. The next question, where should small businesses upload their supplier performance risk system assessment outcomes?
Michael, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I believe that if you go to, I'm not certainly not the SPURS expert on it, but I believe that if you go through and go to PI, that's sort of the launch pad for all things SPURS. So if you go to the spurs.csd.disa.mil, that is sort of the launch pad with frequently asked questions, and certainly has information on how a small business or any contractor is supposed to go through and upload their assessments.
Right. There's also information in the clause in your contract that actually sets forth the requirement for you to do that. So Michael is correct. It is through the PI. It tells you in there, even, it sends you to the registration link if you've not yet done that. But Michael is absolutely correct. It is through the PI. It is through the SPURS system. And once you go in there, you all kind of get a little bit of different look than we get. But there is a link that actually says, when you're actually uploading your assessment, it is right there in that particular system. But if you start with the clause in your contract, it should be able to walk you right through to where you need to be.
Great. So we have a couple questions about CMMC, our favorite topic over here. Are the costs incurred for CMMC compliance reimbursable via the awarded contract? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Michael, do you want me to take that, or you want to take it?
You can take it if you think you have a good answer for it.
I do have a good answer for that. I just didn't want to hog the microphone. So the cost for becoming CMMC compliant is like any other compliance requirement. It is something that would go into your overhead, unless you are part of some pilot program where they have directed you to do that as part of your statement of work. It is not a directly reimbursable to any particular contract, and that is just through pure cost accounting standards, right? So unless you only have one contract with the government, that contract would obviously then bear that cost. Otherwise, it would go into your overhead just like security or anything else would. Did I break up?
No, I think we've lost Michael's.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. So yeah, you would put that into your overhead costs and spread that across all of the contracts that would be appropriate to be CMMC compliant, but that would be an overhead cost.
And just to follow up on the CMMC discussion, will the DAN have its own policies, supplements, or approaches to CMMC, i.e., will the DAN supported information system development, or will CMC cover all of the departments?
So there's Ms. Jackie Blanton in our office is the CMMC expert. Her and I tag team for a long time, which is why I know just a little more than the average bear right now on this. I do not expect, I've not heard anything that indicates that there's going to be a separate DAN implementation for CMMC. What I have heard recently, however, is that Ms. Blanton is developing a training packet. That's what they called it, so that's what I will tell you it's called. And what we would probably do with that, quite frankly, is upload it to our contracting resources page once it is fully developed and put out there. So again, Michael provided you the links to the DASN-P page. We try to put documents out there that we think would be useful. And so if there is a Department of Navy developed, you know, I'll call it SPAC, frequently asked questions, we would probably put it there. If it becomes anything mandated for Department of Navy use, then it would go via an NMCARS change into the NMCARS. I will tell you, most of the time, we don't do changes that impact contractors directly. We do though, you know, we typically roll off of the implementation through the FAR and the DFARS. Most of which you will see, I'm going to say 95% of the content that you see in the NMCARS is that information that is directional to the contracting officers and therefore not requiring rulemaking. So there are a few exceptions to that where we require some statement of work language. So there's some cybersecurity information in there that we have some specific language that the Navy wants. And then there's some trademark language in there that we have some specific language. And then across the Department of Defense, there's what was formerly ECMRA, now the ICF language in there for capturing services. Hopefully that answers the question. If not, kind of jump back in there and do a follow-up.
Will do. Well, let's talk a little bit about the federal minimum wage that you informed us about earlier. To confirm, did you say that the new federal minimum wage will be applied to existing contracts that have already been awarded?
So the executive order as signed, and that's the reason I worded this very specifically, so let me be clear. The executive order calls for all contracts starting in 2022 to actually have that $15 minimum wage. This is the reason I said to you to keep your eye out on the implementation of that, because until such things are implemented into the regulations, that is, it's not, the EO is great. The implementation of the EO is what defines how the procurement contracts that you all are performing under will operate. So it's extremely important to understand that there may be nuances between the executive order and the implementation in the regs. That's the reason that when Michael was talking to you earlier, he said that yes, the small business may go through and implement some of the regs in the Federal Register. However, until such time as we get those in the FAR and the DFARS, we actually don't use those in our contracting. So, or with limited exceptions, we don't use those in our contracting. So the intent through the executive order, as I read it, is that it will apply to contracts that are currently in place. But there's going to have to be some mechanisms to make adjustments to those. And that is the kind of things that would show up in the Federal Register note.
All right. Well, with that, we are at the 2 o'clock hour, and I would like to say thank you to Ms. Randolph and Mr. Brown for sharing their wealth of knowledge and expertise with our small business community. And
Thank
also,
you very much. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I wanted to say thank you to Mr. Smith, to you, Ms. Washington, and also to Ms. White. She has been a phenomenal help to us in, kind of putting all of this together and ensuring that, the small business community has a place to go to get their questions answered and to continue to grow, understand the opportunities available to them. We really do appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today.
And with that, thank you all for joining us today. If you have any recommendations for a topic you would like to see presented, please forward us an email at osbp.pao@navy.mil. Until next time, stay safe and stay healthy. Thanks, Ms. Randolph and Mr. Brown.
Thank you.